Hi, this is Pat Iyer with Legal Nurse Podcast, and today I've brought a guest on who I've been wanting you to hear from. Lori Combs is a registered nurse with 25 years of experience, and she has a specific focus with a background in emergency medicine, PACU, telemetry, and primary care. Lori is an independent legal nurse consultant who has built her business around, in part, working on cases that have criminal implications. She has a background performing sexual assault nurse exams. She's a certified forensic consultant. She has completed a nurse death investigation course, and she obtained her bachelor's degree in criminal sciences, and she provides expert witness testimony in criminal cases. Lori, thank you for joining us. I appreciate you being here.
Thank you, Pat. I'm extremely excited to be here.
And Lori and I have known each other for probably 7 or 8 years, maybe longer.
At least.
And right now we are living in the same city and have had some opportunity to share some meals and get to know each other. I know that Lori brings a wealth of experience to you, and we're going to find it frustrating to try to cover as much as we can in 30 minutes.
Right.
This may be part one of more than one part. I know that LNCs often have questions about what they can do as an LNC helping an attorney who's handling a criminal case. What are the common types of cases that you have become involved in as a legal nurse consultant?
Some of the cases that I work with are related to injury. I'm looking at cases that are involving assaults, which is assault and battery, beatings, things like that. I'm also looking at motor vehicle accidents for criminal cases. I look at child abuse cases, also child neglect cases, as well as looking at homicide type cases where there are gunshot wounds and or stabbing wounds. Those are another area that I can look at, as well as taking a look and evaluating cases regarding DUI.
When you mentioned about looking at automobile cases for criminal aspects, can you tell me a little bit more about that, what that means?
So if you're looking, some of the cases that I've had, specifically one that I'm actually working on right now is a criminal case where it was actually a hit and run, and the individual that was impacted is now deceased. And so there are criminal charges now on the person who they are accusing of driving the vehicle.
Okay, I understand. I became aware after hitting, I think, my first out of 4 deer in New Jersey, that there's impact damage from deer that are different than impact damage from people. And
Sure.
Specifically, a little tip that I learned the hard way, $500 per deer per incident. That deer leave hair, which is like it attaches to the radiator like static electricity.
Right.
So if you have, for example, I'm just thinking this through now, if you have somebody who hits a person and then claims it was a deer when they take the car to the auto body shop, that might be a tip off to the auto body shop that this person's not telling the truth.
Right, that's possible.
Interesting. Well, that's a little side note. And may you, as my listener, not ever be involved in a collision with a deer, but I have done it, survived. Not a pleasant experience.
No, absolutely not.
When a legal nurse consultant is working on a criminal case, are you always behind the scenes, or are you ever identified as a person who will go into court to testify? And if so, under what situations?
I am brought in on occasion as a behind-the-scenes consultant, but on some cases will be brought in as a testifying expert. There are certain cases that I do not feel like I would be qualified to testify on, such as the child abuse cases where you have a shaken baby, allegation, and those can be extremely complex cases, and so especially involving the brain and if the child has survived. So they tend to have a lot of complications, and I think that that's probably best for a pediatric neurologist to testify on. So that's one area that I do not testify on. However, any type of blunt force trauma, including your assaults and sharp force trauma, and your DUI cases, I will testify on if I qualify, if I'm qualified.
Mm-hmm. The shaken baby cases are interesting in terms of the physiological findings that are associated with that head trauma.
Right.
Could you tell us just a little bit about what you as a legal nurse consultant might be looking for in examining medical records of a child who's been suspected of being abused in that manner?
Well, many times in these cases, they're looking at what caused the injuries, whether it be contusions or fractures or like a brain bleed. So that's usually what they're looking for. What potentially caused that? Can they actually determine when those injuries possibly occurred? And can they actually tell potentially maybe who had caused those injuries? So those are the things that I look at mostly when I'm reviewing criminal cases, is to look at the mechanism of injury, because that is very important in these cases to determine, because you have a report from the care provider or the parents or whomever the report is of where the child was at the time, and you have to match that up with what is being found on the medical records for the actual injuries. So the mechanism of injury, timing, and the reported statements from the individuals all sort of have to match up to determine whether it is possible that this is a non-accidental trauma or if this is an accidental trauma.
Mm-hmm. I worked on a case where the mom's boyfriend was accused of injuring the child, and there was a lot of complex investigations with looking at his background, looking at the description of the incident, looking at, I think the question is whether there were hemorrhages in the child's eye that might be consistent with shaken baby. There was a lot of suspicion, and the attorney who was defending the boyfriend was trying really hard to keep him out of prison. And I think he was able to convince the jury that this baby had fallen as an injured as opposed to being shaken. It made me realize there's a lot of complexity to those cases and a lot at stake.
Absolutely. They are definitely very complex, and you have to sort of look at every different angle and determine whether there are potential other etiology for the actual injury, because many times there's nobody that is witnessing the possible incident, and so it's not always cut and dry where you can actually draw a straight line to say that, yes, this is absolutely 100% based on non-accidental trauma. So in some instances, there may be other explanations for the injuries that are seen.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. When you get identified as a witness to go into court to testify, how are you qualified? Meaning, what does the attorney tell the jury about your background so that they see you as credible?
Well, the majority of my background has been in emergency medicine, so I've pretty much done trauma for my whole career, and I have been reviewing criminal cases for, I would say at least 4 or 5 years now. So I've had much experience in that way, and I also attend multiple conferences and things related to criminal cases to keep up with education, and also, you know, learning further learning and education.
Would a legal nurse consultant who doesn't have that background be able to testify in court on a criminal case?
I think the biggest thing with criminal cases is that the mechanism of injury, the nurse needs to understand the possible mechanism of injury. So that if a nurse is working in the area of trauma and they understand the possible mechanism of injury, it is possible that they may be able to, you know, discuss and be qualified as an expert with their nursing background for reviewing these types of cases.
Mm-hmm. I can think of a case involving a guy who was sitting beside the road in his truck and was hit from behind and taken to the ER, where he was in severe pain because he was thrown through the windshield. And then the nurse gave him morphine, and then they drew the blood, and the blood was positive for opiates.
Right.
And the defense attorney told my client, you know, your guy was just sitting on the side of the road shooting up and getting high at the time of the accident. And when I went through and looked at the timing, I was able to convince my client. And should that case have gone to court, and the defense very quickly backed off from that position after I pointed out the timing, I would think that a legal nurse consultant could go through that medical record without having an ER background and just point out the simple sequence of events.
Yes, absolutely. You know, it certainly depends on the case. But sequence of events, timing is one of the major components in criminal cases, for the fact that because they're looking at a specific injury or incident, that they're trying to determine when did this happen or who did that. And so timing is definitely a major factor in these cases. Mm-hmm. And sometimes, you know, it may be undetermined as to specifically, you know, whether or not the accused actually, you know, was the suspect. So it can be difficult sometimes.
Mm-hmm. I can think of another case in which a woman claimed that she was sexually assaulted, and the attorney asked me to define, since she was a patient in the hospital, who was in the room at what time in that time period in which she claimed somebody came into the room. Was she left alone during a critical period of time? And, you know, when we chart as nurses, we chart 10 o'clock meds, for example. We're not actually in that room at 10 o'clock. So it turned out to be looking for my assignment, turned to be looking at, did she have blood drawn? Did she have lab results that were reported or that were taken at that time? What medications was she on? When was her care charted? And it was really hard to narrow down exactly when she was alone based on hospital records.
Right.
Another thing that I have curiosity about is when nurses are in the emergency department and they are cutting off clothes, as they love to do. Some victims in with trauma. You know, are there considerations that ER nurses are trained in terms of how you cut off clothes, for example, if somebody has a stab wound? Or how do you preserve evidence? What are they trained to do?
Well, when I was at the bedside, we were not trained to be cognizant of any type of evidence. So I don't know to date whether or not, you know, there is education across the country of what should be done. The forensic nurses who are involved in SANE exams, they are fully aware of, you know, the potential for preserving evidence. However, they are not always working in the ER as a staff nurse. They're actually, working with the hospital as specifically, in the SANE. So I don't know at this time whether or not across the country, but at the time when I was in the ER, from 1996 to 2011, we were not taught to cut around any type of gunshot wounds or cut around any type of stab wounds, things like that. I mean, it would make sense, but I think for nurses in the ER, obviously the number one that we're thinking about is saving the life. So I don't know if that is something that is done now, but it would be absolutely great to have more education in the ER, because it takes 2 seconds just to go around a gunshot wound or a gunshot. So if they're cutting off pants or clothing or things like that, so that they can potentially preserve the evidence.
Mm-hmm. Interesting that they're not being taught, because that can have such a critical factor in the analysis of a wound, the type of knife, the entry of that knife, or the entrance and the exit wounds for bullets.
Right. Like I say, I don't know for sure now, but at the time, I was never involved in a specific type of class or education, on preservation of, potential evidence when trauma patients come in. I've never, ever been involved in something like that.
Well, I think we've just identified a new area for education.
Right? Absolutely. Absolutely. I agree.
And tell me, for people listening who are interested in taking on these kinds of cases, who are their clients? Who hires legal nurse consultants to help on criminal cases?
Well, you have actually the majority of the cases that I end up working with are defense attorneys. I find that prosecution tends to utilize the medical staff that saw the child or saw the victim or, and treated them. So the doctors and nurses are typically who the prosecution ends up having testify. Now, not to say that they don't hire nurses to testify, but in my experience, I have not yet been hired by a prosecution. So the attorneys that are hiring me right now tend to be defense attorneys.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. And then is the attorney paying for your services, or is the attorney getting the money from the client? Or do you think there are cases where you could have been helpful, but the client doesn't have money and the attorney's not willing to spend money? How does that financial piece work?
Well, typically my relationship is with the attorney. As far as if it happens to be a state case where it is a government case by a public defender, then that money comes from the funds from the state. Private attorneys, I do not know whether they specifically are paying out of their pocket and then they get reimbursed from, their client. That is something obviously I'm not involved with as far as that goes. I am receiving the check specifically from the attorney. My relationship is with the attorney.
And if it is being funded by the government, does the government ever come to people helping with cases and say, this is what we're going to pay, and we don't care what your usual rate is, but we're going to pay you X, which is usually less than a private rate?
Right. Usually the case has a specific budget. Normally for GAAC cases, they are lower than the normal rate that you would be able to charge for a private attorney. So they are at a lower rate, and the attorneys do have a specific budget that they are allowed for specific cases.
And for our listeners who are not familiar with that abbreviation, could you spell that out?
No.
JAAC.
It's JAC, and it's, oh gosh, now, Pat, you put me on the spot for a minute.
Justice?
It is, sorry?
Could it be justice? Could be the...
I think it's the Justice Association, not committee. Yeah, I'm drawing a blank, sorry.
Okay. Well, if it comes back to you before we end, you can always end it. You can always add that in.
Right, right.
And of course, this could be different for our listeners who are in other countries, because we have listeners in 72 countries at this point, and they may have a completely different system in terms of who's paying for the services of legal nurse consultants. But that's helpful to know what the system is that you're used to.
Right.
We've been talking about specifically criminal cases. If you were asked, as I'm going to ask you, how do they differ than working on a medical malpractice or personal injury case, what would you say?
I think the biggest thing is that looking at criminal cases, the attorneys are specifically looking at the mechanism of injury, and they are looking specifically regarding the actual injury. In medical malpractice cases, you're looking for negligence, and they sort of are looking for information that has occurred prior to, and then up to the event, and then afterwards. Same with the personal injury, whereas the attorneys are very focused on the actual injury. And so the reports that I write are a little bit more brief and a little bit more succinct, specifically to the actual injury.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So I'm envisioning, for example, two guys who are having a fight in a bar under the influence of alcohol, and one of them decides to punch the other one in the face and fractures an eye socket and causes a subdural hematoma. Under that scenario, what type of report would the attorney be asking you to write?
Well, basically, depending if they want me to write a report, I will then look at the actual mechanism of injury for that specific injury. So then base information and provide them the information on how that actual injury could have occurred, and if there's any other possibilities of how that injury could have occurred.
So, for example, if he gets punched in the bar and then he walks outside and he trips on an uneven sidewalk and hits his head, then that head injury could be blamed on the guy who hit him in the face. It
could, but it also could be related just specifically to the trip and fall. Mm-hmm. So, there's certain things that you're looking for as far as tying all the information together and the specific mechanism of injury.
Mm-hmm. I got it. So you could be, in your reports, providing education to the attorneys, summarizing the injuries. Is that the general flavor of the intent of the reports?
Right. Usually I provide a small summary of the events. And it's usually, a few paragraphs. It's not really in a large amount of detail. Then I provide what exactly the injury is in medical terms. And then I explain what that is specifically and how that could have occurred and other possible mechanisms, so that the attorney is aware of other possibilities out there, especially if there are no witnesses of the actual event. So they have to be aware that, there are other circumstances or other ways that the injury could have occurred, so that they have the opportunity to fit all of the pieces together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would think that that would be very challenging if that injury occurred with no witnesses and you're trying to establish what happened.
Right, exactly. And that's what happens in a lot of child abuse cases. Typically, there are no witnesses to those types of cases, and the abuser is not coming forward, and the child, if they are nonverbal, then they're not able to state, what specifically happened. So there again, your timing and mechanism of injury can be challenging, and it's important to provide the information to the attorneys on both of those aspects.
Is there any other aspect of working on criminal cases that you find to be challenging?
I think all of them are actually challenging, just to, for any of the cases. You never know what can come across your desk. Sometimes, attorneys are looking for different things, and so trying to provide what it is that they're looking for. And your opinion may not really be what they want to hear. So, sometimes that can be a challenge, that they are thinking one way as far as how the actual injuries could have occurred, but based on your medical knowledge and what you're reviewing in the medical records and what you're seeing in the medical records are not consistent with what is being reported. And sometimes that can be a bit of a challenge, and that happens in medical malpractice cases as well. So,
Mm-hmm.
And that's the way that it has to be. I mean, even though I end up working with defense, I am not solely specifically biased to the defense. I have to tell them exactly everything that's in there, and if say on a child's fracture that there is no other explanation other than that child being pulled or yanked or something like that to cause the injury, then that's what it is, and there's just no way around that. And that's what I explain to the attorney. It's basically the facts on everything and how it is and how it looks and what is most consistent, and sometimes that's not always what they like to hear. You know that, Pat.
Yes, it makes me think about a conference that I attended in which the attorneys were given a set of facts. And sitting in the back of the room, the traffic light was red when the car went through it. I was listening to the attorneys talk about how you can take the facts and make them fit your theory of the case. And as legal nurse consultants, we provide the facts.
Right.
And we're not trying to fit it into the attorney's theory of the case. And you're absolutely right. And that's something that cuts across the board on all kinds of cases. The attorney
absolutely
has his own theory, but the medical record doesn't support it. And we
right.
have to make sure that the attorney understands that.
Absolutely. And that's exactly in criminal cases as well. The mechanism of injury is, it either is or it isn't, most consistent with X, Y, and Z. Are there other possibilities? Maybe yes, maybe no. So, and that has to be explained out to them, and then they do whatever they need to do with that information.
Yeah, I'm glad you stressed that point, Lori, because that's something that we always have to remember.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's what we're here for. We are fact finders and providers of information and education.
I know that at the end of this podcast, we've stimulated some thoughts in our listeners' minds, and they're curious, and maybe they find this fascinating like I do. I find criminal cases to be wonderful tests of your analytical skills, and with so much at stake, people who could end up going to prison for years.
Yes, absolutely.
Whether or not they're innocent or
yes.
guilty. How can our listeners find out more about what you offer?
My website is criticalanalysisconsultingrn.com. And you can visit there, and I have some great blog posts on there that you can take a look at, and also look at it some more information about my services. You can email me at Lori, Lori Combs, Combs, at criticalanalysisrn.com, and you can get me at any time I'm very responsive on my email. But I welcome anybody to take a look at my website and take a look around, and especially take a look at some of the blog posts.
Well, excellent, Lori. Thank you so much for spending some time with me talking about criminal cases. We've covered quite a bit of ground. I think we've emphasized that LNCs working on criminal cases can provide behind-the-scenes consulting as well as expert testimony. They can work for either the prosecution or the defense, although the defense seems to have a higher need if the prosecution are using the caregivers.
Right.
And that if you are working on a government case, no matter what your rates might be, they may be dictated by the government and you don't have any say in that. The type of training that you've emphasized, that you've got critical care, trauma, death investigations, which is a whole other subject, which I find fascinating, we didn't have time to talk about, can impact your ability to interpret medical records. We need to do some work with those emergency nurses in terms of teaching them how to cut off clothing in particular and
Right.
preserve evidence. And that we need, as legal nurse consultants, to continue to adhere to our integrity of telling the attorney the way it is in the medical record, as opposed to trying to please attorneys to support their theory of the case, which is not supportable by the medical facts. And if they go down that road, it could end up being a real problem for them in terms of...
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I appreciate your time, Lori, and I appreciate listeners who are listening to this program. Thank you for tuning in to Legal Nurse Podcast. I know you might be walking the dog, cleaning your house, gardening, jogging, or driving back and forth to work while you're listening, and I appreciate you spending this 30 minutes with Lori Combs and I. Be sure to tune in next week when we have a new guest, a new topic, a new interview. And if you haven't already done so, download our mobile app, which you can find at legalnursebusiness.com/Biz.edu, Bizedu, where you can get our blogs, our podcasts, our courses, our webinars, our free reports, our videos, and lots more. Thank you so much for being part of Legal Nurse Podcast and listening today.